Welcome back to another episode of the Kings Pulse podcast presented by the Kings Herald. My name is Brendan Nunez, and today the Kings made a trade for Kevin Huerter, so I thought it was fitting to get someone on board that could give us a little bit of insight on Kevin Huerter, and for that reason I have Glen Willis, contributor for Peachtree Hoops, including podcast host for the ATL and 29 podcast that's part of Peachtree Hoops. What's going on, Glenn? How are you doing, man?
I'm good. I had a hard time keeping up with all the crazy news today, but I think now that I'm towards the end of the business day, I'm caught up, and I'm definitely ready to talk Kevin Huerter with you.
Yeah, it's a lot to keep up with for sure, and did a different pod earlier today, and in the middle of it, Rudy Gobert gets traded to Minnesota, so just a chaotic time in the NBA, but pretty exciting and easy to forget that we even have Summer League tomorrow, at least for Sacramento, so a lot going on pretty quickly here. And just to start to go through the details of that deal that ended up happening between the Kings and the Hawks, we had Kevin Huerter getting traded to the Kings in exchange for Justin Holiday, Maurice Harkless, and a 2024 first-round pick that's lottery protected. And then after that would go to top 12 protected in 2025, top 10 protected in 2026, and if it does not convey by then, which would be a shocker, it would turn into 2 seconds. Let's just start, Glenn. Like, what is your initial reactions when you see this deal go down?
Yeah, it's a little surprising to see the Hawks kind of quote give up on a guy who's 24 years old and has already shown a lot. When I think of Huerter, I especially think back to the run the Hawks made to the Eastern Conference Finals 2 seasons ago, and he was just an absolutely huge contributor during that run. But the Hawks, with the acquisition of DeJounte Murray, Huerter presumably doesn't have a starting spot anymore. Travis Schlenk, the president of basketball operations, is kind of known for wanting to help his players kind of be in a situation that's good for them. In addition to that, a lot of people that cover the team are suspicious that the Hawks want to function as an over-the-tax team this year, and this move gives them a little bit more configurability. So, for example, if they decide to move Harkless and not keep him, that they're getting a little bit better kind of a salary cap kind of position to kind of get under the tax if they want to. But I don't think anyone's surprised that they moved one of Bogdanovich, Huerter, or John Collins. But I think Huerter, his versatility and his ability to shoot the ball and a function as secondary creator probably drove a lot of natural market interest there. So from the Hawks standpoint, if I'm talking from a Hawks fan, I don't like to see Huerter go. I think he has a ton of potential still and has shown so much. On the other side, a guy like Hawks really need to improve on defense a lot, and Justin Holiday brings that. Harkless, if healthy, also brings just a lot of good veteran things on the defensive end of the court that kind of comes along with him. And they needed another draft pick because they sent so many to the Spurs in the Murray deal. So it's an interesting deal. I think it could work out well for both sides. But it's always hard to see a young, promising player kind of move on. The fan base gets invested in him and such.
Yeah, it's kind of funny how Bogdanovich and Huerter are swapping places after a little bit of delay in between the two, and feel like they have somewhat similar skill sets. And I think from Sacramento's point of view, it's promising to hear that Atlanta fan base and people that cover the team are kind of looking at it as, sad to see him go, and maybe there's more potential there. I was shocked to find out he's still 23 years old and not long from being 24. Admittedly thought that he was a little bit older than that. And just in the first year of a 4-year, $65 million contract that I think is a pretty good price for Kevin Huerter. And then just to cover a little bit of what my perspective on what the Kings gave up, Justin Holiday is in theory a better defender. We didn't see that at the end of last year, but the second half of the Kings season last year, it's kind of hard to gauge what anybody really did. They, had 6 different guys come in and out of the lineup at the trade deadline, and with Sabonis and Halliburton being a big swap, there was just a lot of change and a coaching change in the middle of the year. It was a weird season for the Kings, and Harkless was a guy they talked about as maybe their best low man defender, and that's something that they're losing. But it wasn't all too great at hitting open shots, and at very least, the Kings need guys that can hit their open threes. Last season, they ended up ranking 28th in catch and shoot 3-point percentage at 35.8%. And there were only 11 teams in the league that shot worse than 36% on catch and shoot threes, and 8 of those 11 didn't make the postseason. Huerter comes in, and Harrison Barnes is the only guy that was on the roster at the end of the last season that shot a better catch and shoot 3-point percentage than the 41.9% that they're going to be getting from Kevin Huerter. And I think we can just kind of start there. Like, how good of a 3-point shooter do you view Kevin Huerter? Because it's easy to look at the numbers and just simply, like I said, 41.9% catch and shoot 3-point shooter, 38.9% on about 5.5 triples per game last season. But also Buddy Hield's numbers look pretty good by the end of most years, and Kings fans knows that he can be pretty streaky, and maybe it doesn't quite feel like that. So when Kevin Huerter's out there, do you view him as a really high-level 3-point shooter that's constantly getting the respect of opposing defenses on a nightly basis?
For sure. He's a guy who can spot up kind of 2 full steps behind the 3-point line. He has that kind of range, so he doesn't have to be right up on the 3-point line. If we're talking about kind of as a spot-up shooter, he's about as good as it gets. He's excellent in that mode. I mean, we all know who the best, several shooters in the league are that are kind of in the tier of their own. But if we try to kind of talk about that next tier, he maybe is in that second tier. He's that good as a spot-up shooter. Depending upon how much detail we're going to get into, he's not yet been as good shooting while coming off of screens. He's known for being good shooting on the move, but for whatever reason, just kind of sprinting off of a screen, whether that's floppy action or some other sort of pin down initiation. And for me, as I've watched him, across these years in Atlanta, that's come back to 2 things. One is conditioning, and the other is just some injuries, which impacts his ability to hit at a high level of conditioning. I think a lot of Hawks fans, when he came in, thought, oh, this could be our next Kyle Korver, right? And Kyle Korver is as good as any player in history shooting on the move. You think about, Redick and those types of guys, right? And I thought Huerter took a step forward last year in his conditioning and being stronger. He came in as a pretty, thin guy and all that sort of stuff. So there may be some untapped potential to even get a little bit more shooting versatility. But as the guy who could spot up really deep, well beyond the actual 3-point line, super reliable 3-point shooter. He's willing to pull in transition, which I mean, we'll see what they do under Mike Brown, but the Kings have historically wanted to push the pace of building around De'Aaron Fox and such. So in that sense, I think there's a lot of good, reliable shooting there. It'll be interesting to see if some of the stuff they've run for Buddy, where there's a lot of coming off of screens, if he'll get any of that, and if he does, how well he do, if he'll improve there or not. But a great shooter, generally speaking, with that one little area to maybe look at whether there's some growth there.
Yeah, off movement, I think, is kind of where I view the upside, and maybe there being even more potential. But at very least, the Kings will take a damn good spot-up shooter, because desperately needed with guys like De'Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis. And Mike Brown talked about in his intro presser paint touches being super important to him, and spacing is just going to make it easier for Fox to drive into the paint, and for Sabonis to be posting up and things like that. And when it comes to Huerter, his off the bounce 3-point numbers were not phenomenal. What did you think of his ability to kind of create for himself and in the pick and roll? I would assume that he's a secondary creator on this roster for sure after Fox, Sabonis, maybe even like if HB or Murray emerge a little bit in those aspects. That I don't think that's something he's asked to do often, but here and there, how do you think that Huerter performs in that aspect?
Well, shooting the 3-point shot, creating his own 3-point shot was more kind of up and down for him this year. And this was a really different season for Huerter. This was Nate McMillan's first season managing the team, and the Hawks kind of went away the Hawks saw a lot of variety in the kind of defenses they face. A lot of teams started switching a lot more as a way to kind of try to contain Trey and other different kinds of coverages. And Nate preferred the Hawks to kind of get into one-on-one attacks, find the mismatch after a switch and attack there. And Huerter was just not as comfortable doing that. He often caught the ball pretty late in the shot clock once it kind of rotated to the weak side and such. Now, he's really grown a lot dribbling into the mid range and creating a shot in the mid range for himself. He's probably one of the better mid range shooters in the league, especially self created. And especially kind of attacking the weak side, right? When the ball's rotated to the weak side and him attacking. So he's much more reliable and seems more comfortable and confident dribbling into the paint, getting to about a step below the free throw line or kind of in that general vicinity. It's legitimate 6'7". He has great elevation and a lot of confidence creating that shot. Now, because Trae's so ball dominant, Huerter, just had less time on ball last year. I thought he struggled with maintaining the kind of rhythm and the amount of rhythm he'd had in prior years, and I thought that affected him at times as a shooter. You could see in games where he wasn't getting as many touches and such that the perimeter shot, the 3-point shot, wasn't quite as reliable. And it'll be interesting to see an offense that's built around Fox and Sabonis, like you mentioned. What does his kind of touch volume and touch frequency look like there? Sabonis is as good of a passer you get at the position. So you got to think that I think this is going to be a great fit for Huerter, and I think he's going to likely find himself getting the kinds of touches and the frequency touches where some of the rhythm he had in prior years, where he was a little better in some areas of shooting. I think that'll come. Fox shares the ball wonderfully. Sabonis shares the ball wonderfully. Trae dominates the ball. I'm not saying that critically. That's what Trae is and does. And I have to think, if I were to ask Kevin Huerter right now, he's probably kind of excited about this change and the opportunity and the role that might be more optimized for him this year heading into Sacramento, playing with Fox and Sabonis and others than trying to get sometimes infrequent touches playing next to Trae.
Yeah, I think him and Monk might be the competition for minutes there, and maybe Terrence Davis is kind of in that situation. But if I'm guessing, I think that Kevin Huerter is, in my mind, the starting two guard right now. I think there's still a whole lot of changes that are probably going to take place for the Kings. It wouldn't surprise me there's one more significant move that ends up happening with the Rashawn Holmes or Harrison Barnes. But I think that as that two guard that is primarily playing off Fox and Sabonis, that it makes a lot of sense. You mentioned that mid-range game. Yeah, 32% of his shot attempts came from the mid-range, which is a decent frequency in today's day and age, and he knocked down 49% of them at a good rate. Do you think that kind of is, in a way, making up for his game at the rim? It seemed like, from what I saw, he doesn't do a phenomenal job of getting fully to the rim and finishing when he's there. Am I on point with that, or?
Hit the nail on the head. Like, if there's an area to his offensive game where even pro Herder fans in the Hawks fan base were frustrated, was just the lack of ability to kind of go to the rim. From watching, it seems like an aversion to contact. I think he's played like 8,000 minutes in his career and has a really low number of free throws. I want to say even like 250 or so, somewhere in that. Like it's kind of wild how seldom he goes to the free throw line, and especially because he's a
36.
Oh, so I even gave him a little more credit than he has. So that's been an issue. Now, so his ability to get to that 10-footer, if you will, and convert at 49% helps with that. But when he's on the court and the opposing defense has a legitimate rim protector, I never personally found myself feeling frustrated he wouldn't go attack that. I think he's smart to get to that mid-range pull-up and shoot from there. When the other team is playing a small lineup, maybe doesn't have a rim protector, that's where you're like, Kevin, you need to attack the rim and kind of get there. And there just wasn't that kind of aggression ever to surface with him there. So maybe that's something that his new coaching staff can kind of help him unlock. If he didn't have that mid-range game, I think that would be a real kind of hole in his game. But I think that mid-range game does help there. But because of his size, and he's a really good athlete, and has some pretty good verticality, and could surprise you with a nice entertaining dunk now and then if he has the space to kind of pull that off. And so there really isn't any reason I can see that he can't get to the rim and compete for contact and embrace the opportunity to go to the free throw line. But that definitely has been his biggest area where he's just been unwilling to kind of explore that. So I hope for him and for the Kings that's something he can unlock. But it's been a real area of underperformance in the league so far.
Yeah, absolutely. I did not somehow catch on to the less than one free throw attempt per game when going through his numbers. So definitely eye-opening pointing that one out. And yeah, maybe we can see a little bit of that athleticism in transition, as the Kings are a team that's planning on running and getting out in the open court a whole lot with this roster specifically, and I think Monk kind of fits that as well. So does Keegan Murray. So I think that the guys that they've been acquiring do fit that. I think those transition threes as a trailer is really valuable in helping with their transition, semi-transition game, and Kevin Huerter fits in that aspect. What about him as a playmaker? And it's probably less of as a primary initiator, as we've kind of touched on, but as a connecting piece. What do you make of his passing and decision-making? The Kings have had some guys that I think when the ball swings to them, maybe they're a little bit hectic and out of control with a Buddy Hield or Dante DiVincenzo. But how do you trust Herter's decision-making?
I have a lot of trust in him as a secondary, for sure. And I think in some situations, depending on the opponent, he can even handle some minutes as the primary on the second unit if there's a foul situation or injuries or what have you. He's not going to be like way in over his head if he needs to run the offense for 3 minutes or 4 minutes or whatever in a random, regular season game. I don't think you want to kind of, have that plan on paper to kind of start the season, but he's capable of that. As a lot of teams do now, the Hawks would run sort of that stack setup and get him to one of the 3-point breaks and let him initiate the pick and roll from there. Very comfortable with that. He can hit the skip pass to either corner in that action. Same thing when he's lifting into a DHO, can see and hit the skip pass to either corner. And pretty reliable, kind of noticing, like, say if he's playing with Holmes as a lob threat, if that is still kind of the rotation, sees that too. So I think some of his passing has gone untapped because of how ball dominant Trey has been. But in my mind, he can make all of the even, I wouldn't say advanced passes like the very, very best passers make, but he's a great hit-ahead passer. And then the half court, he reads the defense well, he processes the information well, and just makes the right play and hits accurate passes. So I think Hill will benefit from that. I think Barnes, if he's still on the team, will benefit from that. Monk as well. I think he and Monk can play well off of each other. When the Hawks made the run to the Eastern Conference Finals 2 years ago, he and Bogdanovich, who Kings fans obviously know, like you mentioned earlier, were great at relocating when the other had the ball and hitting that pass to one another, and they generated a ton of offense that way. I could see him and Monk and Hield kind of getting into that type of kind of rhythm too. So I think that'll work well. I think for secondary playmaker, and especially considering he's only 24 and has some room to grow, I think he's above average there. And provides probably, I don't know if I'd say significantly more passing, but a good bit more passing than the average 2 guard in the league, especially if we're talking about guys under 25.
Yeah, the Kings definitely, fits everything that they need in a 2 guard in my mind. That stack or Spain pick and roll is something they ran a whole lot with Buddy. They ended up running it with Dante too. Could see that working with Huerter. They did a lot of hurry-up offense, DHOs with last year as well, something that you kind of mentioned there. So easy to see how that fit sort of makes sense offensively in Sacramento. And to move to Huerter on the defensive end, from some of the things I was kind of combing through today after this trade happened, it looked like there were an okay amount of times that they were asking Huerter to kind of defend point of attack, since Trey is maybe not the most ideal guy to be doing that. What do you make of Huerter on the defensive end? I guess we can start with on the ball.
Yeah, I thought he took a little bit of a step back on defense this past year. It's a little bit hard to evaluate him individually because the Hawks as a whole took a pretty big step back on defense. They struggled to contain at the point of attack. Part of that was missing Hunter because of some of his injury absences. They were negatively impacted when Cam Reddish didn't work out as a guy that they wanted to keep around and kind of keep in the rotation. And they ended up kind of pretty shorthanded. So I would never design my defense for him to be the guy who's always taking the other team's kind of best creator. He's okay on ball, but the best initiators are going to get past him regularly enough that's probably not going to be how you want to go. He was really impactful on defense in that run to the Eastern Conference Finals. In fact, you can go back, and if you look at who had the most number of block shots in the 2021 postseason, by volume. Only 3 players had more than him. I think he had 16 blocks in that
Wow.
postseason run. So he can surprise you guys at the rim. He's really good helping from the weak side, getting to the rim. He has great timing. He knows how to get right to the front of the restricted area. But when it comes to kind of defending the other team's biggest threats, he's better chasing a guy like, say, Seth Curry, like he did in that Sixers series, over flare screens and pin downs. He's really, really comfortable top locking and using different techniques like that. You put him on the ball and have him be impacted with multiple ball screens in a possession, he's more likely to get separated from his guy and not hold up as well. And so I would, it'll be interesting to see how the Kings, solve for that. Fox has such an offensive workload at times that it's hard to ask him to be the point guard defender all the time. I think Huerter can do some of that if you're not dealing with a team that is built around their point guard. But when it comes to kind of designing the best role for him, it's going to be chasing a guy like a Seth Curry or a Joe Harris or those types, around pin downs and flares and all that sort of stuff. I think he's well above average in that area. And as a help defender, he can really surprise you. Like I said, just being on time, tagging at the right position, getting to the rim and helping, and a pretty good rebounder for a guard as well. His size comes into play there. So, again, I wouldn't line him up to be the guy I want on ball all the time or to have that as his primary role. As a supporting defender, like I mentioned in those different areas, I think he's really reliable and can be a really positive defender in that sense if you carve out the right role for him.
Yeah, it sounds like the Kings are getting a handful of players. I would say that Keegan Murray fits the same thing. Malik Monk got better on that end, but still not amazing. I think that HB fits the description of like a guy that can be a part of a good defense, but I don't know that he's making your defense that much better himself. And I think some of the issues that maybe Huerter has that make it hard to evaluate, like you said, him as an individual defender that he dealt with in Atlanta. Don't know that it's going to be all too much better in Sacramento. They're getting a lot of spacing, but still to be determined on how much defensive progress we see from a group that 2 years ago was the worst defense in the NBA and really didn't get all that much improved this year. It's going to be a lot about systematic changes in my mind and buy-in, and how kind of Mike Brown ends up changing that end of the floor for the Kings. And so at very least, like, I think that Huerter's a better defender than maybe what I originally realized. There's that good size to him that you mentioned as well. Do you think that there's a better position for him between the 2 or the 3?
I don't think so necessarily. Depends on the matchup and the opponent. I think his versatility comes that he can defend someone's and he can handle playing at the 2 or the 3. And he can also handle, because of his size, switching. If Atlanta the last few years has run a lot of what the league typically calls the red scheme, where you're switching 1 through 4, selective switching and read-based switching 1 through 4. He did well there, and the size certainly came into the play there, and his ability to process information and communicate. So I think we've talked about the kind of actions and the kind of role that best fits him, but I think his primary value as a defender is the versatility. And that he can you can throw him into a lineup with different guys, and he doesn't have to be in one specific role at a time. You can kind of move between roles, and that gives you more lineup configurability, especially when you think about how you're going to man the second unit or mix guys that are starting and on the second unit. So I think the versatility is a real strength for him, and hopefully the Kings can kind of find a way to get enough defense on the wing, and that he's part of that solution. Because if he's asked to be the best wing defender in the starting lineup game in, game out, as we've talked about, don't know that that's the best for him or the team. There's may still be moves to be made, but I think he's a positive defender. He's a helpful defender, and he has shown flashes like in that the playoffs, a couple years ago, where he was a real impact defender. And I root for him a lot, and I enjoy the Kings. My in-laws live in Sacramento, so I've seen a lot of games there, and probably know more about the Kings than any other team that's not the Hawks. So kind of have a rooting interest there as well. So I hope he gets back to being more of the defender we saw in that playoff series when they made their run to the conference finals, because it's a lot of fun. And he also has a knack for coming up with a big stop late in a close game. He's come up with like several blocks on guys that got free run at the rim. So, 1 point game, last possession, he kind of gets to the rim and comes up with a block, or gets a deflection or whatever. So he has kind of an ability both on offense and defense to kind of be a little bit of a clutch gene, kind of getting back a little bit of the kind of what Bogdanovich gave the team for a while on offense a few years ago, you know. So in that sense, he's a really fun player, you know, and the Kings, in my mind, have one of the best fan bases in the whole league. And I would just love to see him do really well. The Kings fan base enjoy them. And I'll be rooting for that for sure, because he's a really fun guy to watch, especially when he has it kind of going and when he has the confidence, and when he's showing that confidence, a little bit more aggressiveness comes, and that's when it's really fun.
Yeah, that's interesting. I did not know you had the Sacramento connection prior to that, so that's pretty ironic. Works out well. Also, just in news, I guess, Dante DiVincenzo just went to the Warriors on a $9.3 million 2-year deal, and guy Sacramento didn't extend the qualifying offer for, which not sure about that situation, but player option in year 2. We'll see what ends up happening with Dante. I think he should be a pretty dang good fit in Golden State in my mind.
Agreed.
I want to ask you a little bit about the contract of Kevin Huerter. We talked about it, but the 4-year, $65 million. In your mind, is that a good deal for a player like Huerter? I feel like, I guess I'll open it up to you there. Is that a good deal in your mind for Kevin Huerter?
I think it is. I've always said the player that Huerter is right now on a really good team, like a team that could win 55 and push for 60 wins, he might be best as the third guard, not because he's not good enough to start, because his versatility coming in, and if a point guard goes to the bench and he needs to be on ball for a few minutes and things like that, depending on how that all works out, that might be the case. But if you looked around the best teams, that's what a lot of really, really good teams are spending on their third guard, who they rely on for secondary creation and some primary defensive roles and things like that. That said, I think he is a credible starter on even an average team in the league, and with some growth that he's even more than that, right? And that certainly has to be what I think the Kings have in mind there. So I'm completely comfortable with this contract. I think he could, exceed the value, especially if he can kind of show some progress in a few areas and stuff. So I don't really have any anxiety, whether I'm thinking from the Hawks perspective or now the Kings perspective, around that contract. I have no concern that he won't deliver enough value for that. And, knock on wood, if some more growth can happen, I think he could very well exceed that. The one area I think that could have been a little concerning is he was a little injury prone his first couple years, but last year he was available kind of start to finish. He had one minor injury there, but he's played 8,000 minutes, in 4 seasons, and he's been more reliable in the last few years. I think he's really bought into. I never know. You don't know how true this is, but he's bought into being more committed to his nutrition and other aspects of kind of the training kind of regiment, things like that. And that showed last year. He was much more resilient when he took contact and had minor injuries. He got back to the court more quickly. So especially because of that, I think that that makes me feel that much more confident that that's a good contract, and any team should be comfortable owning it, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Between Kevin Huerter and Malik Monk is still less money than what Buddy Hield is making. So I think that the Kings are in a pretty good spot. I feel comfortable with Kevin Huerter's contract. If anyone in the chat has questions for Glenn regarding Huerter, but as we kind of start to wrap up here, feel free to shoot them our way. I think you touched on it a little bit, but kind of as we start to wrap up here, 23, about 50 days from turning 24. What do you see as kind of the swing skills for Kevin Huerter as he continues to develop, and where he could potentially take his game to the next level?
Yeah, I think it's working harder to get out in transition. I think it's hard to maximize Fox if his backcourt mate isn't really committed to kind of making that work. And where, like I said earlier briefly, he's really good as a head-to-head passer, but Fox needs players that will run with him, will sprint with him, and buy into that. He's been willing to kind of, be the trailer and kind of get into that mix, but he needs to be a little more committed to kind of being the guy that's sprinting to one of the corners when Fox is kind of attacking the middle of the court in transition. I'll give you an example. The one game the Hawks won in the playoffs last year against Miami, Trey ended up with a floater in the middle, and basically DeLon Wright cleared out the whole floor for Trey by sprinting from the right side all the way to the left corner. And when Huerter was on the floor and kind of was not, it seemed unsure what he was going to do, and he ended up kind of being the trailer, as he always is the case. But that's just an area of nuance where me, with my coaching background, I look at that and say, Kevin, you were ahead of DeLon when Trey got the ball. You've got to be the guy to sprint to that corner. Right. And so I think in order for him to help maximize all the talent that Fox brings to the court, sprinting in transition, being committed to that is really critical. And then when he on the weak side, when he attacks, when Fox, say on the strong side, or Sabonis on the strong side, has really commanded a lot of attention to defense. When he sees a seam, attack that seam aggressively, get in there. If there's contact, embrace it, get to the free throw line, and such. So those are the two things: is commit to sprinting in transition, and when there are seams on the weak side, don't settle for a wide open 3-point shot, even if it's there. You need to attack that leverage defense. So that's what I see there. And then if he can, as he gets a little older, even being pretty young, become an even stronger physically defender, and maybe handling guys that are have more weight than he does. He has good size at 6'7", but maybe being able to defend guys that are 220, 225, kind of in that range. I think those are the areas I would look for growth that could really kind of move the needle in terms of the value he brings.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. The nuances of transition. He'll get a lot of opportunities in my mind this next season and years past to kind of get all that down, especially alongside Fox. I think Sabonis fits that well, and some of the other guys we mentioned. One we got from the chat here. Best nickname. This is Royal Rebounds, Barry. Shout out if this is Barry. Does everybody just go with Red Velvet? Is that the go-to nickname?
That's the one that you hear like on TV and in the media that's used. It's and I see it there in the chat. Someone kind of came up with that, but that seems to be the one that everyone kind of gravitated to. It'll be interesting to see how this plays into his new team, his teammates and such. But when he would do something like, because he's white and fair skinned and stuff like that, when he would like throw down a really impressive dunk, his team used to call him Kevon in that case instead of Kevin. So we'll see interesting to see if that follows him to Sacramento. But that's the only other one that I would hear sometimes, is when he kind of does something really athletic in the game. You would hear that sometimes, hardly on TV, but everyone knew that was a go-to for the teammates. So those are the two that I heard. And Red Velvet, everybody, he's a pretty smooth player, so I guess that works. But I'm not the nickname guru, but that seems to be what the consensus seemed to align on that being the proper nickname for him.
Yeah, definitely. The Kevon one is pretty funny. I appreciate that backstory. That's one of those ones in here in Basketball Reference. Last thing I got for you, Glenn. What else do you think Atlanta's offseason looks like? There was the DeJounte Murray move, now this Kevin Huerter move. John Collins has been linked to Sacramento a lot. I don't know that fit is still the most ideal with them drafting Keegan Murray, and HB, Harrison Barnes, in my mind, would be the primary return. What do you think the rest of this offseason looks like, specifically when you're talking about John Collins?
Well, I think we all know we've heard so much noise around John Collins going to get moved, and I think we're still hearing that. But it'll be interesting to see if that actually works out, because now Gallo is gone. Gallo was the other power forward in the rotation last year, and with Murray coming in as not a shooter, right? He has a ton of other offensive value, but they need shooting at the 3 and the 4 ideally when Murray is on. And so Collins as a shooter, I know he's not a big volume shooter, but he's a pretty reliable 3-point shooter, is pretty attractive. Now he's getting paid $25 million a year, and a lot of Hawks fans are like, "Oh my God, he can't be the second best player on the next really, really good Hawks team." That's probably true, right? So it'll be interesting to see if they look to make that move. We've heard the Celtics have had some interest in him, but they're bringing in Gallo now, so you wonder if there's still kind of space for that. And they made the move for Brogdon, so it seems like there's probably not. I think they still have the trade exception, but who knows? So it all comes down to, can they move Bogdanović if they want to give them more clearance of the tax? Bogdanović had knee surgery, so I think his market is pretty slim, probably at this point in time, unless they were going to attach a pick to that, and maybe hard to do that with what they already sent out in the Murray deal. So I think they've improved themselves a lot defensively. They have more point of attack defenders. Aaron Holiday, Justin Holiday, the brothers there. Murray obviously kind of helps move the needle there. And so now it's kind of, I think, figuring out in that 10-man rotation, like, how do we get a little bit more shooting there? how do we get a little more versatility at the 5 and the 4 combined, depending upon whether JC is still around or not. And so I think that's where the work on the roster is. Okongwu and Capella, if they're both back, indeed, and I think they will be, are both lob threats and play finishers. And so if they could find more playmaking at the 4, or like a backup wing that has some veteran, playmaking kind of opportunity, that's probably what they go for. But it'll be interesting to see, how that looks. It's hard to know what it's available. Travis Schlenk is kind of an opportunist when it comes to deals, and so I think it'll just come down to kind of what pops up there. But if they mostly are done, it wouldn't shock me, right now. Apart from maybe making sure that come the trade deadline, if they're not lined up to be like a top 4 seed or something like that, that they have an opportunity to make a deal that gets them under the tax right before the trade deadline expires. And I think with the Harkless deal, probably gets them in that range if they need to find a way to move that, attach something to move that. So they could be done unless another opportunity pops up, but we'll see. I know Hawks fans are interested in, are we going to see Jalen Johnson play in the rotation this year and stuff like that? And AJ Griffin, does he play this year? And Nate is famous for not playing rookies and not playing young guys. So a lot of whether they need to do more work on the rotation depends on if they actually have plans to get Jalen into the rotation this year or not. Same a little bit with Sharif Cooper. But Nate wants veterans, so I'm sure he's still bugging Landry Fields and Travis Schlenk to go get 1 or 2 more veterans he can play.
Yeah, it's crazy. I forget all the young guys that are on that team. All 3 of those young guys that you just mentioned, I was a big fan of. Cooper, Griffin, and Jalen Johnson. Jalen Johnson was a very popular one at draft time for Kings fans. Was surprised he fell so far. And AJ Griffin was a popular one in this last cycle too, if they were to have potentially traded down. But Glenn, I can't say thanks enough for coming on, man, and sharing your perspective and insight on Huerter. Super helpful for myself, and I'm sure the rest of Kings fans.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun to talk with you, and hoping for a great season from Huerter, and I'll probably get down there for 2 or 3 games this next season. I normally do, so it'll be fun to kind of catch up and to see how he's doing even in person when I get the opportunity.
Absolutely, yeah. Let me know when you're in town. And that's Glen Willis from Peachtree Hoops. Also does the podcast that's under Peachtree Hoops, the ATL and 29 podcast. And myself, Brendan Nunez from the Kings Herald, and definitely check out the site and all the great work coming on from the guys and gals, including myself there. Take a look at their Patreon to support local independent Kings coverage. And if you enjoyed this episode of the Kings Pulse podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review. And you'll hear from me again in the next couple of days.